Welcome, Vita. Our question for you today is how and what does Ukrainian art and literature contribute to the world?
The most important thing to emphasize while talking about Ukrainian art and literature, in my opinion, and what it has contributed to the world is that the very existence of such idiosyncratic art and literature that has come out of Ukraine is in itself a major contribution, given that Ukraine as a state and a culture has always been affected by colonization and imperialism, primarily Russian and Soviet, but not exclusively. With the recent escalation of Russia's war on Ukraine, an interest in the country's art and literature has only heightened. And many decent articles covering the subject have recently appeared in the global media outlets, to name just a few, The Guardian, The Atlantic. And together with the myriad of scientific resources produced, for example, here at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, for one, check out our Internet Encyclopedia of Ukraine, as well as our sister institutions such as Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute and other global centers of Ukrainian studies around the world. There is really no shortage of information on Ukrainian art and literature. I encourage to explore it yourself. Specifically in this small short little video, I will only give you some examples of general underlying features of Ukrainian literature and art that, in my opinion, present a truly unique addition to the global history of art and thought. And those primarily being the cultural diversity of Ukrainian art and literature, as well as its critical anti-imperial decolonial thinking. If you look at the globe and just see where Ukraine is located in relation to the history of the world, you will probably find yourself agreeing with dissidents Mykola Khvelyovy, Ivan Dzyuba, and others who have argued Ukraine to be a collision of East and West, geopolitically, but also in terms of cultures and civilizations. Traditions that comprise formation of Ukrainian literature and art reach as far back as the tribal history of the region that dates before the ancient Greeks and share various multicultural traditions of both Eastern and Western influences. All genres of historical representation exist in Ukrainian art and literature, just as you will find them in the history of arts globally. Though arguably the most famous to the non-Ukrainian audience examples of Ukrainian artistic history are probably Ukrainian Baroque or Cossack Baroque, as it's also known, Ukrainian modernism of the early 20th century with the names familiar to the entire world, such as Vasil Yermilov, Kazimir Malevich, Mikhailo Boychuk, Vasil Kryczewski, Alexandra Ekster, Sonia Delaunay, and many others. And postmodernist movements circa dissolution of the Soviet Union and the establishment of independent Ukraine, especially in the early 1990s. And especially in the names of world-famous Yuri Andrukhovich and the literary formation Bubabu, just to name a few. Linguistically, Ukrainian literature is as diverse as it is culturally and has developed in a complex interaction of borderlands and transnational relations. Culturally, Ukraine is a very non-homogeneous place, and its every region is defined by robust local cultures and many language forms spoken. Ethnically, it is composed of Ukrainians, Russians, Romanians, Belarusians, Crimean Tatars, Bulgarians, Hungarians, Poles, Jews, Armenians, and others. All of those traditions are present in Ukrainian literature and art. Ukrainian art and literature often had to cultivate its distinct cultural and national character in circumstances of statelessness and persistent offense to its sovereignty. And thus both art and literature of Ukraine spans in time and space far beyond the contemporary borders of the state and even its statehood in history. A large portion of Ukrainian art and literature has been produced in exile, displacement, and immigration, and has developed in a consistent dialogue with traditions that shaped European and global waves of artistic development. Check out, for instance, the body of work produced by the New York poetry and art group in the mid and late 20th century called the New York Group, or any work by Yakov or Jacques Hnizdovsky, a Ukrainian-American painter, printmaker, designer, illustrator, and sculptor. Or another huge example, for example, is Alexander Archipenko, a Paris emigre from Ukraine whose sculptures and paintings can be viewed in permanent art collections across the globe. And those examples are very many. For instance, MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, has just unveiled a new gallery dedicated specifically to Ukrainian art from their permanent collection, which again is huge. Through the centuries of its existence, both Ukrainian art and literature endured much censorship and prosecution for expressions of its national identity and cultural idiosyncrasy. Expression and publications in the Ukrainian language were banned and heavily punished all of the way into the late 19th century. And then in the 1930s, as a result of Stalinist repressions, generations of writers and artistic avant-garde were executed. Systemic infringements of the freedom of speech and artistic expression were routine throughout Ukraine's Soviet history. William Blecker has recently described Ukrainian literature as, I quote, one of defiance in the face of imperial arrogance, end of quote. Blecker, a literary scholar based in London, demonstrates that Ukrainian literature has established itself largely in opposition to Russian imperialism, including in the works of world-famous Lesya Ukrayinka, Taras Shevchenko, and Mykola Gogol. Visual language that Ukrainian art and literature share has developed in continuous engagement with Ukraine's oral histories, folkloric knowledge, and tradition. Relationship with the land and its sovereignty has significantly impacted Ukrainian artistic expression and has been showcased, for example, in the works of Maria Primachenko, or the genre of what is called poetic cinema, represented, among others, by Alexander Dovzhenko. While Chernobyl nuclear disaster of 1986 has shaped a genre of literature and artistic expression marked by a reflection on the event's impact on a global scale. Ukrainian literary scholar Tamara Gundurova, for example, studied this post-Chernobyl literature period of Ukrainian independent Ukraine extensively. The last 30 years of Ukrainian independent art and literature have been marked by a series of revolutions. Orange Revolution of 2004 and the Revolution of Dignity of 2014, as well as establishment of even more robust civil society. It is marked by inclusion of more and more young nonconformist voices that arose out of its rich historical tradition. New successes and new genres have been developed, especially in poetry, visual arts, and music. Thus, Ukrainian literature and art has always been embedded in its history and always reflected its political and sociocultural life of its actors. With this, I would like to encourage you to explore it for yourself in much greater detail. Thank you.
Thank you, Vita. You've actually inspired me to dig a little deeper and learn a little bit more about our art and culture. Dr. Vita Yakovlyeva is a research associate with the Contemporary Ukrainian Studies Program at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, with a focus on contemporary Ukrainian culture and children's culture. Thank you for watching another episode of the Rapid Response series, Did You Know? CIUS Answers, a response to your questions about Russia's war against Ukraine.